Speaking of which, corporate bigwigs are also changing things up. Their green targets, that's what they're changing. The latest is BP, the British oil giant. In 2020, BP announced a very ambitious target to cut their oil output by 40% by 2030. The goal was to move towards renewables. Last year, that target was scaled back from 40% to 25%. People did raise some eyebrows, but they thought, well, something is better than nothing. Well, now it is nothing. Latest reports say that BP has abandoned the target altogether. They will not reduce oil output by 2030 at all. In fact, they're doubling down. BP is eyeing 3 oil projects in Iraq, 1 in Kuwait, and 2 in the Gulf of Mexico. But why the change in direction? Well, mainly 2 reasons. One is investor concerns. BP shares are 17% down in the last 6 months. So the company wants to turn things around. How? By focusing on its bread and butter, or in this case, oil and gas. Reason number 2 is geopolitics. You see, Europe is turning away from Russian oil and gas, so there is an energy crunch in the region. Renewables alone cannot solve it. And it's not just BP. Shell is doing something similar. They planned a 45% cut in carbon emissions by 2035. That target has been removed. And why just firms? Why just companies? Why just oil firms, in fact? Other companies are also doing it. Consider the auto industry. Toyota was planning to sell 1.5 million electric vehicles by 2026. 1.5 by 2026. Their new target is 1 million. Volvo was planning to go 100% electric by 2030, again cancelled. Ford had set aside 40% of its annual spending on EVs, electric vehicles. It's been cut to 30%. Mercedes-Benz said half of their sales would be EVs by 2025. They have revised it to 2030. Even governments are guilty of the same. Look at what Britain did last year. They were supposed to ban petrol and diesel cars by 2030. But they delayed it by 5 years. They also pushed back the ban on gas boilers. Now, do you see the problem here? Climate targets are already seen as half-hearted. So the last thing you need is revisions. It erodes public trust in climate action. You see, these targets are mostly self-imposed. Even the UN goals are not binding. You saw the United States leave the Paris Climate Accords under Donald Trump. Any country is free to do that. They can revise, reduce, or cancel their commitments. The question is, why do they do it? And politics, we can tell you, is a major factor here. You need stability to invest in green energy. You cannot do it in the middle of a conflict. Just consider the Ukraine war. The targets were set during peacetime when Russian gas flowed freely into Europe. When that stopped, energy prices increased, and along with it, inflation went up. So European leaders faced a simple choice: continue the green pivot and risk more inflation, or use fossil fuels to cool the prices. And most leaders picked option number 2, which is not surprising at all. Secondly, the clean energy supply chains are vulnerable. You need specific resources to build batteries and panels like cobalt and lithium. Around 70% of the cobalt comes from the Congo. 40% of the nickel supply comes from Indonesia, 55% of mined lithium from Australia, and 25% from Chile. Most of the processing happens in China. They make up 60% of all mass-produced clean technologies like solar cells or windmill systems or batteries. And this sort of a supply chain is not reliable, especially if you're de-risking or decoupling from China. So the problem is quite obvious. World leaders and corporate bigwigs made grand commitments, and they earned a lot of praise for it. But their roadmap was not charted out well, nor did they account for political hiccups. In hindsight, they look like half-baked promises. The fact is, we need some way to enforce commitments, if not on companies, at least on countries to start with. Else, climate targets will mean nothing.
Firstpost decodes the U.S. election. Explains how America chooses its president. Your primer on the race to the White House. Everything you need to know about how America votes and its global implications. U.S. Election Explained. Every Monday and Thursday only on Firstpost.